Thanks very much, Laskin and Corla, and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the debate this evening on this Freedom of Information Bill. I think looking at researching for this contribution tonight, I think one of the things that stood out the most, and probably the last two contributions have highlighted it very starkly as well, is that the caution with which this bill has been welcomed by people like the Information Commissioner and other commentators. And it's very telling when a piece of legislation comes forward where it can only be welcomed with caution. And it depends really on how the spirit of how the bill will be implemented after it's enacted as to how we can gauge the success of it. And I think that when we're introducing legislation, we should be very clear in what the legislation wants to achieve and what needs to happen with it, and that we shouldn't be seeing that the caution being expressed in the welcoming for a bill and for changes that are taking place in something as important as a Freedom of Information Act, which is the citizens, one of the few ways that the citizens can acquire information to see how decisions are being made in their name and on their behalf and that affect their daily lives. So I think that this bill does need to be amended at committee stage to remove some of that uncertainty and to remove some of the get-out clauses that the Minister has and that public bodies have in the type of information that they can release to members of the public, because I think that's very important and needs to be addressed. When the original Freedom of Information Act was introduced in 1997, it did start, I think, a real culture of change within public bodies, and it was the start of a process. And I remember in 1997, I was actually working with Donegal County Council at the time, and it caused a lot of concern for council officials, because now they would have to be accountable and they would have to keep records and be able to stand over decisions that they had made. And so, I mean, it did start that cultural change, and it did change the bodies and how they dealt with things and how they made their decision-making processes, and opened decision-making up to some form of transparency that it could be looked at by citizens and gauged to see whether it was effective, and made them do their jobs properly, I would say. But then in 2003, of course, Fianna Fáil infamously amended the Freedom of Information Act and put in all the restrictions in place and introduced the fees as well, which basically undermined all the provisions that had come forward from what would have been progressive legislation at the time. And this Act, while it does undo a lot of those amendments that Fianna Fáil brought in, and that has to be welcomed, again we get back to the spirit of how the Act will be implemented after this becomes law, and that will be the key thing. So it probably will only be in 2 or 3 years' time when we can actually see how effective, if at all, this legislation has been and how it has opened up to transparency decision-making in the state. I would welcome some of the provisions in the Act, and particularly in relation to new bodies that are being brought under the Freedom of Information. I think the Office of the Refugee Applications Commissioner and the Refugee Applications Tribunal, I think that's very important, because the whole operation of the refugee system over the last 11 or 12 years in the state has been brought the state, I think, into real disrepute, because there's been no transparency, no openness, completely arbitrary decisions, and some of the most vulnerable people in the state who have no access to recourse at all have never been able to have their applications dealt with. Indeed, there's some people here who are living in direct provision for over 10 years in the state, and they still haven't had their decisions made. And maybe if there could have been Freedom of Information requests going in relation on behalf of those people, it could have speeded up that process. So I would welcome that they are being brought under the Freedom of Information Act. I would also welcome the fact that the Gardaí are being brought under it, but again, I'd have to question, why is it limited to its administrative records? There is enough provisions already in the Act in terms of security and state security that they can refuse requests for information already there. So why is it just being limited to the administrative records? I think we need to open up the Gardaí fully to freedom of information as well, and I don't think any public body should be afraid of accountability. I think every public body should welcome it, and it should be striving to make sure that they can provide as much accountability as they possibly can. But I think that we see maybe again the power that the Gardaí have, where they can get this limitation put into the Act to protect them in terms of how they see their role within our society. I would also have to question why Irish Water hasn't been brought in under the Freedom of Information Act. I know the excuse is there that that it could be commercially sensitive information, and so therefore it couldn't be included. But we see that Irish Rail are being brought into the Act. And the Irish Rail are very like Irish Water. They're a monopoly and a semi-state company operating on behalf of citizens. But Irish Rail can be opened up to freedom of information, but Irish Water can't.
2 minutes remaining.
It doesn't make sense at all.
Oh, no, made fuck.
Okay, thank you, Las Cancorla. I would also welcome the fact that the deliberative process being used within departments that amendment has been taken out of the 2003 Act, because I think it is important to see how decisions can be arrived at and how decisions are made. And I would just query why the exemption in relation to parliamentary briefings and draft PQ replies has not been taken out, or has not been included, because it would be very interesting to see the original drafts of parliamentary answers before they go on the official record here. And I think the excuse is that the record here provides all the accountability that's required. Well, I would doubt that very much, because I'm sure there's some PQs that go through a few drafts before they actually arrive back into this House and go on the official record. And it would be very interesting, and it would open up departments to an awful lot of scrutiny that would be welcome scrutiny in how decision making is made, if we could see, and under the Freedom of Information, the drafting process that takes place in relation to answers, and how maybe answers can be made woolly and filled up with useless information, and that in order to hide the actual real information that maybe somebody is looking to get. And I'd also just finally like to say, in relation to the fees, I think I welcome the reduction in fees, but I think the Act doesn't go far enough. It should remove the fees entirely, because again, if we want to be fully open and want to be transparent, there should not be fees there, and particularly in relation to the retrieval fees. I think there shouldn't be fees. Departments shouldn't be able to set their own retrieval fees. I think there should be a set fee, and if there's going to be a fee at all, and that should really just be the only thing that comes here. So I think that it's interesting, just as I said earlier, that the fact that everybody's welcoming this Act with caution. I think that's very worrying, because it's going to be worrying for the working of this Act in the years to come. And unfortunately, it will only be in 2 or 3 years' time when we'll actually see how this Act is operating.